So I'd like to bring on the first of our temperate rainforest experts now. I'd like to introduce Dr. Rick Meinzer. He is a research ecologist with the Forest Service's Pacific Northwest Research Station. And Dr. Meinzer, why don't you tell us a little bit about the temperate rainforest?
Okay, thanks, Patty. Well, this Alaskan rainforest that we're in is similar to the one you heard about in Puerto Rico in that it's wet here. Much more precipitation falls than the vegetation can use. But beyond that, there are some big differences that I'll talk about. The rainfall, part of the precipitation in this forest falls as snow during the winter, and it's more seasonal than in the tropical forest as a rule. During the summer, there's often a dry period, and that dry period gets longer as you go further south to the rainforests in Washington and Oregon. And you also heard a little bit about the role of wind in the forest in Puerto Rico. Well, we certainly don't have hurricanes here, but we do have high winds. A couple of days ago, we had some 80-mile-an-hour winds. And these winds play a role in shaping the forest because they occasionally knock trees down, and those trees that have fallen form gaps in the forest that allow trees that have been hanging around in the understory to grow up and become part of the forest canopy. Another important difference is in the number of species in the forest. This forest around us here has basically about 3 species of trees that dominate it: Sitka spruce, western hemlock, and red cedar, whereas in a small area of tropical forest, it's not uncommon to have more than 100 species of trees and hundreds of species of shrubs and other plants. The types of trees in this forest also differ. These trees are conifers, meaning that they bear cones instead of flowers. And tropical trees, of course, in tropical forest are flowering. Other differences are that conifers have needle-like leaves. This is a hemlock branch here with small needle-like leaves, and we call tropical trees broadleaf trees for obvious reasons. They have big, broad leaves. Another one of the differences between conifers and tropical trees is you can't see it from the outside, but it's in the wood. Most of us think of wood as a pretty solid thing. We build furniture and houses out of it. But if you look at it under the microscope, it's actually porous. And that's because the water that comes from the soil up to the leaves in the canopy moves through wood. And the plumbing that the water moves through in conifers is really different from broadleaf tropical trees. Conifers have small little cells about the length of an eyelash called tracheids in the wood, and the water moves up through the tracheids. It's very different in broadleaf trees. They have these little building blocks of their plumbing system, these little hollow cylinders that are stacked end to end to form vessels. Another big difference is in the height of the trees. The tallest temperate rainforest trees are up to 350 feet tall. That's in the coast redwood area, about 700 miles south of here, whereas the tallest tropical trees are only about half that height, about 150 feet tall or so. And despite the fact that these forests have a lot of water, for a tree that's 350 feet tall, it's a big problem to get water to the top. It has to move all the way from the roots, hundreds of feet up to the leaves. Water is really heavy. If you've ever tried to carry a 5-gallon bucket of water very far, you know how heavy it is. So these trees are pulling columns of water hundreds of feet tall up to the top. And that's a pretty risky proposition because if that water column separates, the top of the tree dies. All around me here, hanging around on the trees, you see epiphytes. Epiphytes are just simply plants that grow on other plants. And in a temperate rainforest like this, the epiphytes tend to be pretty simple plants. We've got a lot of mosses around here. There's a moss. This branch is heavily laden with mosses. And the other type of epiphyte that's really common here is lichens. And here you see kind of a hairy little lichen. And lichens are pretty neat because they're sort of a cooperative arrangement between 2 life forms, between a fungus and what we call a cyanobacteria, which is a blue-green bacteria that can do photosynthesis. And these lichens are really hardy because when the forest is dry, when it stops raining for a few days, these dry out and they go dormant. But as soon as it rains, they absorb water and they can do their photosynthesis right away in just a few minutes. The epiphytes in tropical forests are mostly flowering plants, orchids and bromeliads. There are about 10,000 species of orchids at least worldwide, and a couple thousand species of bromeliads. If bromeliads are in the same family as pineapple. If you in a forest like this, if you try to walk 100 feet in a straight line from here to another point, you find out that it's really hard to do it. You run into a lot of biomass. Biomass is simply living and dead biological material, the trees. These trunks that are around me here have probably been here for many decades, and the reason why temperate forests have so much biomass hanging around is because they're so much cooler. You heard earlier that it's about 85 degrees in Puerto Rico today. It's only about 40 degrees here. So at those kinds of temperatures, this biomass decomposes really slowly. The bacteria and fungi that make it decay work really slow in conditions like this. Also from down here, this forest is hundreds of feet tall. It's hard to see what's going on in the upper canopy, but what we did was we took a trip into the upper canopy of a forest that's about 700 or 800 miles from here in a canopy crane in Washington, and we're going to show you that in this video that follows. Okay, we're going to take a trip into the upper canopy of an old-growth temperate rainforest. We're here at the Wind River Canopy Crane in Washington State, and this is a joint project between the U.S. Forest Service and the University of Washington, and Ken Bible here is with the University of Washington. He's a scientist. One of the big differences between the tropical and the temperate rainforest is just the shape of the tops of the trees. You saw in the tropical trees that the crowns of the trees or the tops are umbrella-shaped or hemispherical shaped. Well, these temperate trees, these conifers, have very long, narrow crowns that go down maybe more than 100 feet down into the canopy. And that's a pretty good adaptation for where these forests grow, because they grow in the northern latitudes. The light angles are quite low in the fall and the spring, and that's a good adaptation to trap light. So what we're going to do is take a trip down the crown of this tall Douglas fir tree. It's over 200 feet tall, and the crown is very deep. It's maybe over 100 feet long from top to bottom. So there'll be leaves carrying out photosynthesis all the way from the top of this tree down into the forest. Because that's one different thing about this forest from the tropical forest, in that light penetrates very deeply into the canopy. Whereas if you go much below the top of the canopy in a tropical forest, there's very little light. Okay, in both tropical and temperate forests, the upper canopy here is where a lot of the action is in terms of what the forest does. The forest sucks up incredible amounts of carbon dioxide from the air during photosynthesis and gives off a large amount of water vapor. And with regard to water, here we are more than 200 feet above the ground, so the water has to get from the soil to the upper branches of these trees. And we found that in these old conifers like Douglas fir, it could take 2 to 3 weeks for water to get from the forest floor up to the top of the tree. And in work that we've done in tropical forests, we find that it's much quicker. It may only take a day or two for water to get to the tops of the trees. Part of that's because the trees are shorter, but it's also because these trees have different systems inside for conducting water. Tropical trees have pretty large tubes to conduct water, and the water moves really quickly. These conifers, like Douglas fir, have very small little tubes, and the water moves slowly. In terms of photosynthesis, one thing that we do at the top of the canopy is to measure photosynthesis with portable instruments like this. This is a little chamber that we can seal around the leaves, the foliage, like this. And air circulates between this chamber and a main instrument, and we can actually tell how much carbon dioxide these needles are taking up. And an interesting thing about these temperate conifers in this rainforest is that they can be active year-round. As long as it's above freezing, they can do their photosynthesis, almost like a tropical forest, which is active year-round. If you go into a more interior forest, say in a place like Montana or Wyoming, the trees go completely dormant during the winter, but not these. One thing we notice in these tree crowns, because they're so long, is the leaves or the foliage changes a lot going from the bottom to the top. Near the bottom, the needles are flattened and pretty wide and large, and as we go toward the top of the tree, you'll probably notice in this fir tree that the needles become shorter and they're kind of more erect. They stand up straight. And part of that's due to the difference in light between the bottom and the top of the tree, but part of it's due to water and how difficult it is for the tree to get water from the bottom to the top of the tree. Because it's so hard to get water at the top, when the needles are growing in the spring, they don't expand as much as near the bottom. So that's part of the reason why they're smaller. Just wanted to summarize a few features of rainforest. This one is cold and wet. The one in Puerto Rico is warm and wet. And the number of species here is much lower than the number of species in a forest like the one in Puerto Rico. The trees here are much taller than tropical trees. They have very different shaped crowns, long pointed crowns. Tropical trees are more umbrella shaped. They have different kinds of plumbing. The trees here have a different kind of a vascular system, as we call it. And the rates of decay are much slower in this forest. That's why there's a lot of biomass and dead logs hanging around.
Well, thanks a lot, Dr. Meinzer. That was really interesting, and I learned a lot about temperate rainforests. They're just amazing places, and the Tongass, where we are today, is an amazing place, and it contains most of the old temperate remaining forest in North America. It's an important place for the plants and animals that live here, and to all Americans too. It's especially important to all the communities in Southeast Alaska that depend on the forest for their drinking water, for wood, for food, for fuel wood, for recreation, and for the beautiful scenery that's here. That's really quite remarkable today, although it's still not 85 degrees.